All right. Hey, Nat, what's going on?
Hey, how you doing?
Good. We're not wearing jackets.
See you here. Yeah.
We, for anybody who's wondering, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this to my wife Dana. I took it off. It's a little hot outside, so Nat was kind enough to join me. Welcome to In Conversation. By the way, I guess I'm Sean Gibbons with Communications Network. This is Nat Kendall-Taylor. He runs the Frameworks Institute. And over the last couple of months, we've been doing kind of a fun project together. If I can put you on the spot, what have we been doing?
Yeah, we've been doing a series, I think by the end, which is today. I think.
Yeah.
It will have featured 7 different pieces on the kind of science and practice of framing and communication. And we met not in this exact room, but somewhere along this very millennial space that you guys work in, about 6 months ago, I think, with the idea of, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we wrote a series of pieces that each took on a different issue of the day and analyzed current framing kind of practices and patterns on that issue, and then tried to, where we could, offer some advice on how those issues might be positioned or framed in a different way to kind of move discourse and thinking forward. And we've had some really, based on input that I've received and kind of discussions that I've had with people who've been reading, some really good, and I think, as you and I just said before the camera turned on, useful pieces on some really important issues. So I think it's gone really well, and it was a lot of work.
Yeah. It never is when you're planning it. It sounded so good when we were talking about it.
Just write 6 pieces. Like, I know this. Yeah, I can do this. I'll get these to you next week. But I think it turned out really well. And
I think it did a lot of good. I mean,
I think
that's what we've heard from people. And not to scare you guys, but we look at emails when we send them out to you, and we can usually it's going to creep you out, but we can see when you open them and when you don't. And sometimes when you open them, we've seen people forward them around quite a lot, which tells us either you're explaining what idiots we are, or that they saw something in there that was useful. So we're glad to do that. We'll talk a little bit in just a quick minute about like what frames are in plain English. But maybe before that, like, I've gotten to know you, and you're one of my favorite people. You could explain to folks a little bit about your personal background. I just learned this, and I didn't know this before. You were a competitive swimmer, like a distance swimmer all through college, up to and through college.
Yep.
And then you now have a PhD, and I continually absolutely butcher what you got your doctorate in, which is psychological anthropology.
You got it.
I got it because I asked him a minute ago.
You got it.
How did you get into that work? And then how does that take you from there to here? Like, at what point were you were swimming, you had some time on your hands, and you were like, you know what, I got to breathe, but in a minute, let me just think about, how did you get, I don't want to put words in your mouth. How did you get started?
Swimming actually has nothing to do with my career in framing and the work that we do at Frameworks, but my studies in psychological anthropology absolutely do. And I think the way that I got into anthropology and psychological anthropology in particular was that I've always been really interested in understanding why people do what they do. That sounds really kind of basic, but that's the work that kind of got me into anthropology, and not just why people do what they do, but why different people sometimes do the same things from different backgrounds and orientations, and why sometimes people from the same background and orientation end up doing, having dramatically different decisions and pursuing different paths. And the work that I did in graduate school at UCLA was really specifically focused on health decisions. So how people in particularly kind of challenging or complicated situations make decisions about where to seek treatment and whether to adhere to that treatment or not. So the work that I did before framing sounds like it has absolutely nothing to do with what I do now. I studied how families on the coast of Kenya, on the Swahili coast of East Africa, make treatment decisions about epilepsy. So families with children with active epilepsy, how they choose to go to a biomedical clinic or seek traditional treatment, and then how, based on interactions with those providers, they choose or choose not to continue to see them. And the kind of theory that was underneath that work was a particular theory from psychological anthropology, which is called cultural models theory. So the way in which culture exists not just as a set of kind of Indiana Jones artifacts, but rather in mind, and shapes how people see their worlds, and specifically informs the decisions that they make. And by and large, that's one of, not the only one, but one of the kind of primary areas of theory that we use at Frameworks to study communications and meaning making rather than decision making.
And maybe talk a little bit about what Frameworks is, because obviously we're huge
Yeah.
fans. It's a nonprofit organization. You all have been really active and generous through the network, not least of which through the series, but at ComNet and elsewhere. Explain a little bit about what Frameworks is, how you arrived there, what you're doing,
Yep.
why you exist.
Yeah, so there's the irony is that we do communications work and struggle mightily in a short sentence or phrase capturing what it is that we do.
Feel your
So take this for what it's worth. We are, so I think you already said an important part of what we do is just we're a nonprofit organization, very mission driven. And we do communications or social science research on applied communications questions. So sometimes we call ourselves a communications think tank, but we're really interested in two fundamental questions, or two questions that are fundamental for people who are on the ground, in the field, working to advance issues and looking at communications as a tool to do that work. So first of all, we are interested in and spend a lot of time, probably too much time, thinking about thinking. So thinking and studying how members of the public make sense of complicated social and scientific issues. And we tend to kind of focus on issues that have become known as social justice issues. So how people make sense of issues like immigration, or criminal justice, or poverty, homelessness, climate change. And the second part of our work is then, once we figure out kind of the lay of the land on those issues, how can we use social science to determine the effect of different ways of communicating about that issue? So there's, even if you're on one issue, so if you're communicating about, I'll pick an issue that we covered in the Stanford Social Innovation Review series, addiction, there's a number of different ways that you can engage audiences in thinking about addiction, and we know empirically that those choices have a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those ways of positioning the issue are decidedly more productive. They allow people to come into it. They allow it to see something that warrants attention and is salient, and to support specific solutions. And other ways of thinking don't do that, and frequently do the opposite. Mm-hmm. Force people to disengage and to be less supportive of solutions. And so we're really interested in those two things: thinking, and then framing, which is why frame is in Framework's name. And I think the really cool thing is that we've brought together a group of people from disciplines that don't normally come together. So when I was at UCLA, anthropology is on the third floor and sociology is on the second floor. I never in 6 years went to the second floor.
Wow.
Never, ever. And now I work with a sociologist who was trained on that second floor in the office next to me.
Wow.
And I think that that's a really, at least in the academy, is a really cool part about what we do, is that we realize that understanding something as complicated as communications is not something for a single discipline to do, or that a particular part of research can really see fully.
So this is something you and I talked a little bit, which is that you just mentioned the academy, and I think maybe there's a few folks turning in who are thinking to themselves, wait a minute, does this mean I'm going to have to start doing science? Maybe the answer is no, you don't, but you ought to know a scientist. It's good to make a friend with a social scientist, and increasingly to do this work really well, there's a tremendous amount of research and data that's required.
Yeah, I think I think this has changed. So I've been doing this for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I think that this has changed quite a bit over those 10 years. But my longtime colleague, Susan Bales, who's the founder of Frameworks, has been doing this for longer. And I think she's seen this even more dramatically, that there was a time when communication was seen as an art, where you get creative people in a room, or you get deep issue experts in a room, and you pontificate, right? You say what you think will work, and you're smart people, and then you go out and do it. And I think that over the last, certainly the 10 years, if not 15, people have started to question that as an approach, and rather, I think, to see communications questions as, in some ways, research questions. Mm-hmm. Like, we can actually know what will happen if we frame an issue this way versus that way. And that research can, to use a metaphor, bear with me for a minute.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you.
That communications research in some ways is like an insurance policy, right? It allows us to see and to know what an investment in a particular strategy will do before we invest in it, and to kind of protect ourselves from all the bad backfire effects that may happen to very good ideas.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and I don't think that move from kind of art to science has happened without a lot of effort from a lot of people. But I think that by and large, the field of social issue communications,
I call it communications for good.
Communications for good. The field of communications for good has started to see the work that they do as benefiting from testing, basically, from the idea that you can expose different people to messages and then observe the effect that those frames, those choices have on the things that you want your messages to do. And I think that's been a big shift that we shouldn't take for granted. I think it's a big shift.
It's an enormous shift. I think it also speaks to the idea of communications as a strategic lever for change. Because when you're casting about in the dark, as it were, when you put really smart people in the room, but you're just throwing ideas out there, you have no assurance that you're going to get to where you want to go.
Yep.
Whereas if you can actually marry some science and discipline into this and some listening, frankly, right? And that's really at the core of all communications is listening. You have an opportunity to do a tremendous amount of good and a reasonable expectation you're going to be successful.
Yep. I think it's even more dramatic than kind of getting people in a room and trying to figure it out. It's getting people in a room who are frequently deep experts on the issue that they're communicating about. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you and I say that you are not your audience, it's we nod our heads and there's a knowing smile on our face, and other people do as well. But the degree to which people who are deep issue experts on the thing that they're communicating about forget that, mm-hmm. and assume that the thing that works for me and my colleague will work for normal people who don't study,
people who are living their lives, people having busy things happen,
who aren't experts in poverty, homelessness, climate change, or whatever, is a really interesting trap that I think a lot of people fall into.
And I would even say, you've heard this phrase, I'm sure, I don't want to dumb it down.
Yeah.
I don't want to dumb it down. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues that we took on in Picture This are persistent problems that have existed for a long period of time. And if you talked about how salient and relevant they are to the average American, if you did a poll, they're not in the top 10.
Yep.
They're not. Many of them are not in the top 20. And yet they're burning, pressing questions to which lots of people are devoting a lot of time and effort. All right, I'm going to go to some of the questions I actually promised you I was going to ask you, which is, let's start with kind of the basic one, because I think there's a range of kind of definitions on this. I'm setting you up a little bit here. What is framing? Like in the simplest possible terms, in plain English, what is framing?
So I'll start by saying I agree with your kind of diagnosis that framing has become a million different things to a million different people based on what you're trying to do, in the same way that things like narrative and story are becoming mm-hmm. ubiquitous to the point of kind of losing their contours and differences and definitions. But I think, framing is really the way that the choices we make and how we present information mm-hmm. lead to perceptions or behaviors as a result. So information presentation, those choices, and the effect that they have on, frankly, the things that we care about, what people think, feel, and are willing to do as a result of hearing information.
And that's important because we know you can actually activate people or deactivate people, right? I think that's one of the things that people are always asking, what's the potential impact of communications? And of course, we know it's tremendous, right? It's how we perceive the world, and communications comes at us in any number of different ways. But, Michelle Norris, when we were at ComNet last year, you guys may remember this, she said, God gave us one of these and two of these. It seems to me a lot of the work you guys are doing is focused on understanding how these are working for people.
Yeah, we don't do a lot of olfactory framing.
Oh, I meant the mouth.
But I thought you were pointing at the nose.
Some of us, well, I got a big schnoz, so maybe some of us talk through our nose. So I'm going to assume most folks in the crowd. I'm going to assume most folks in the crowd know the story of marriage equality, right? That goes back to California, to Prop 8, which is where you were born and raised, California, and how it went from a stubbornly stuck issue to becoming the law of the land, where we have marriage equality for everyone. Can you talk a little bit about what role frames played in shifting the public consciousness and shifting the debate to a point where we actually saw the Supreme Court rule and make marriage the law of the land? And then maybe we could kind of take a run at, what are some examples of other wins that came about because of reframing?
So I'll talk a little bit about marriage equality, but I want to first kind of acknowledge with a fair degree of humbleness that there are probably people on this call who
played a role in this.
Have played a role in this.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, and thank you.
Studied this kind of win or transition or frame change in a lot more depth and in a lot more detail than I have. So take all of this at a, for what it's worth, which is, again, not as much as what other people probably can say to this.
Stipulated.
But I think it is, and we nodded to it in our introductory piece to the picture of this series, is that it's, I think, kind of the canonical example where people were talking in one way and people changed and started talking in another way, and where you can see an outcome, at least in proximity, tied to that change.
Yep.
And it is, I'd say, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but to get to the second part of your question, that's why that's such a hard question to ask. So other examples, really kind of finite, specific examples of before, after change are hard to come up with, because it's relatively infrequent that you have the kind of concerted and disciplined change from this to that, and then you can see in a relatively immediate proximity in time that some kind of change happens. So the examples where framing has led to change, I think, are actually harder to think of and come to than I hope.
I think we're in the middle of one right now.
I think, and there are some that you can point to, but I think that the reason why marriage equality gets pointed to so often is the story it allows you to tell as kind of a neat and kind of discrete shift change kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, the argument goes that the field who was advocating for change was using for a long time kind of a rights argument.
Yeah, rights and benefits, right?
Rights and benefits. And for whatever reason, and there's been a lot of people who have analyzed the reasons for it, it wasn't working. It was leaving a lot of people out, and even for the people who it was bringing in, it wasn't doing so with enough kind of power and mobilization and conviction to lead to the kind of change that needed to happen, that was being worked for. And I think the mistake is that we assume that that change only happened once that frame shifted. I think it's important to say for people in the field that folks had been doing a lot of work for a long time in thinking about communications that kind of paved the way to the frame change. So I think it's a little bit of an error to think that it just kind of happened one day and change ensued. But the change was to reframe the issue from one of kind of rights and benefits to one of love and commitment, which I think did two things. So first of all, kind of expanded the constituency, right? So it brought people in who weren't willing to come in when it was an argument about kind of rights, justice, and benefits. And as soon as it was something that more people could identify with and kind of resonate in a positive way with, it kind of built that constituency, and it kind of energized people to kind of engage and mobilize in a way that the previous frame didn't. And I mean, I think there's another couple of ones that have a similar kind of tidiness in terms of it was this way, then it was this way, then change happened, and the other one that gets used all the time is tobacco. And so tobacco for a long time was framed as kind of an individual vice, and I think the field for a long time had a behavior change model that if I can point out the danger of this substance and the error in your ways in choosing to use it, you'll choose to use it less and this issue will get better. And it shifted from vice to defective product, right? In a way that, and when that change happened, it went from you as an individual are responsible to industry and government is responsible. And as soon as industry and government are responsible, a whole set of solutions open up that are not visible or salient if you see it as an individual problem. So people start thinking about policy and regulation in a way that you just don't if this is an individual vice and failure of will. And again, not like it happened overnight, but once that shift happened and people started to see some traction, you kind of paved the way for the policies that have been implemented and have led to change. I think one of the biggest public health wins, at least in the time that I've been a...
Oh, it's profound, right? I mean, you just walk around here and think of like how many, I can only imagine how many cities now make it illegal for you to smoke inside of a instead of a restaurant or a bar or whatever it might be, public
It hasn't
spaces.
been that way for that long, right?
No, it really hasn't.
Yeah.
It really hasn't. So the one that I mentioned, I think we're in the process of, and we're certainly not there, but is guns. And we wrote, there's a piece in Erica Soto Lamb, who was the founding communications director at Americans for Gun Safety, I think kind of spoke to this, which was the idea that when Ronald Reagan, when the assassination attempt occurred on Ronald Reagan in 1982, 1981, forgive me folks, I think it was March of 1981, Jim Brady, the president's press secretary at the time, was shot and horribly wounded. And they created the phrase gun control, which had existed prior to that, but they created a nonprofit that was focused on gun control. And then subsequently, over the last few years, and I think it happened with the assault weapons ban in 1996, they started talking about gun safety, right? And more recently, unfortunately, through the horrific events we've seen far too often, but especially with the attacks at Marjorie Stoneman High School in Parkland, Florida, a conversation about gun violence. Again, that idea of shifting from sort of individual responsibility or from an idea of control to this idea of like gun violence is more of a societal problem. It's a broader problem. Am I fishing there, or is that something that you think is kind of in process?
I think it's in process, and it's actually an issue which I think was mentioned in the SSIR piece, on which, interestingly enough, we've been clamoring to do research on since my very first day at Frameworks, and only just about 6 months ago got our first project with the Missouri Health Foundation.
Oh, cool! Awesome.
Who are ComNet members for sure.
Courtney,
Shout out!
She's watching.
And we're going to actually get to kind of train some of the empirical approach and perspective to this communications and framing thing that we do on this particular issue. But I think it's a great example of a frame change. So frames, there's all different kind of ways that we can frame messages, but one of the big ones is what people are told an issue is about. Is it about control, or is it about safety, or is it about violence? And I would argue strongly that there are major and meaningful differences in terms of how people respond to that issue, and in particular the solutions that they see as appropriate and important based on how that issue is positioned at kind of the issue frame level. Mm-hmm. What is it about?
Yeah.
And I think if it remains about control...
That's tough. In America, that's
tough, right?
Yeah,
that's tough.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of how the sausage is made at Framework. So how research and data, how you use it to actually come up with new frames. So what happens? Because you guys don't just retire back into a room as smart people and come up with this. There's a process. Maybe just kind of walk us through what that process looks like. I mean, there's qualitative and quantitative, I would presume. So,
and this is where this is like a ComNet crowd, so I feel like I can.
You're among friends.
I can geek out a little bit here.
Please
in a way
do.
That I
we go deep geek here.
I wouldn't for normal people. That was a joke.
Hey, by the way, while you're coming up with this, if you guys have questions, you're watching this, I presume, on Facebook, you can start sending them in now, and we'll start taking them, because I shouldn't be the only one having the luxury of yakking at Nat.
These are good questions, though. And this is obviously one that I could talk about at great length. And I think that over the 10 years that I've been at Frameworks, and with a very talented group of people from a whole bunch of disciplines, we've really kind of built and optimized a process for doing communications research. And I think about it as having two kind of components or two parts. And the first is kind of what are the stories being told? Mm-hmm. And there's a whole a slew of methods, a suite of methods that we use to figure that out. Everything from kind of systematic analysis of media coverage and framing on an issue, diving really deeply and looking systematically at the way the field itself frames an issue, which I think, interestingly, maybe ironically, is something that gets left out of a lot of communications work, is that the field itself is actively forming and shaping and changing and pushing and pulling public opinion and thinking. And then kind of the hallmark of that work is individual long-form interviews that we do with members of the public, where our task is to kind of plumb the depths of their thinking on an issue. So not concerned with what they know about guns or addiction or aging or early childhood, but rather kind of what are the deep understandings that are kind of below that at a foundational level.
Is that like values? Is that what we're kind of
It's
talking
values.
about?
So it's back to what I said at the beginning in terms of the kind of the theory that brought me to frameworks is this cultural models theory. This idea that culture exists in mind and informs, even though we're not aware of it or not aware of it very often, informs how we orient towards and think about these issues. That's what we want. That's like what we're after.
So you're trying to pull out of people, what is your culture? Like, explain to me, you as an individual, how you perceive and walk through the world.
Like, what are the assumptions that when I talk to you about stress and adversity in childhood, boom, like there's stuff going on in your head, even though you're not going to tell me, but I know it's there, that you have as a member of kind of this common national culture for thinking about kids and development and growth and stress, that if I'm communicating with you about that issue, I've got to communicate into and sometimes against that. So a lot of our work is designed descriptively to get at that stuff and unpack it. And that's really the first component. And the second big component shifts from descriptive, so describing the stories that are there, to prescriptive, which is coming up with recommendations and prescriptions for how you can better position issues. And to do that, we have our own kind of suite of both quantitative and qualitative methods that we use to do that. But I guess the method that tends to get all the love in that process are these large experimental surveys where we're exposing a large representative sample, normally of the American general public, to different ways of hearing about an issue. And then we're measuring the effect of those differences on how they do the things that we want people to do, the way that they kind of understand an issue, how they support solutions, their willingness to engage, things of that nature. So, I mean, I think this is the thing that I get most excited about as a researcher, is we've put together this way of looking at communications and understanding kind of what's there, but also thinking really systematically and empirically about what you can do to change what's there. And I think I think it's fairly unique to kind of get all that together in a theory of practice that can be used to inform the decisions and practices of people on the ground doing the hard work of changing issues.
I'm going to follow up and say, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Do most organizations, obviously, if they come to you, they're on the journey. They're starting to understand how critical this is. But on the whole, would you say that our sector, folks in the foundation and nonprofits, both folks working in communications for good, I understand that this sort of way of thinking and this approach and this data-driven, research-driven, geeked-out approach to comms that I think you and I are both very much driven towards is that, I might be in the ascendancy, but where are we on that journey? Is it 20% of the organizations get it? Is it 40%? Is it 80%? Is it 110%? We're well past the tipping point?
It's not 110%.
I know that's true.
I think we're past the tipping point.
Do you?
And I think it goes back to kind of some of that time frame that I talked about
10, 15
20
years
minutes ago. Yeah, I think that I would say that most of the big philanthropic players in the United States who are trying to move kind of issues in a portfolio forward see communications and communications research as an important component of what they are trying to equip grantees to be able to kind of go and do the work of grantees. I think that shift has happened. I think when you get down to the level of the nonprofit organizations who are doing that hard work, it's a bit more uneven. And it's certainly uneven when it comes to kind of the ability to fund the kind of communications work that we're talking about, which is, I hate to break it to people, neither fast nor cheap.
Yeah.
And so I think that people kind of get that it's important, and I think that we're past the tipping point on that. I think that kind of how to use it and what to use it to do is still on the ascent, I guess you could say. But I mean, even in 10 years, and again, I have colleagues who can look further back than that, I think there's a big change, both in terms of the demand, but also really interestingly in terms of the supply. There's a lot more organizations and individuals who are kind of thinking about this empirical approach to communications than there were, I can certainly say, than there were even 5 years ago.
I'm looking at my notes here. Do we have questions from folks? Anybody typing anything? Okay, guys, don't be shy, please. You've mentioned that certain phrases or cues can trigger different patterns of thinking, right? So what's the process behind it? Let's play brain scientist for a quick minute. What happens to get people to move either activated or in some cases, I mean, sometimes success is getting people out of the way, right?
Yeah.
Deactivating folks.
Yeah. I think that, so to me, this is the thing that using cultural models theory as a way to think about communications really creates a bit of an epiphany on. So over the years, we've come up with a way of thinking about frames as you said cues, right? So frames as the cues that are embedded in discourse and information. So when you deliver a message, there are cues that are either intentionally or frequently unintentionally embedded in that information. And the way that it works is that those frames activate or cue various ways that we have available to us to think about an issue. And frequently that process of activation, as you said, happens so quickly and immediately such that it's below and underneath the level of explicit intentionality. It's implicit, it's quick, it's kind of system one or fast thinking.
And is this because the brain we're learning is incredibly lazy? Is that a big piece of it, right?
So it's lazy. I like the term of kind of fast and frugal thinking. So if you think about a person, an organism with a brain going through the world, like we could do this, go out and walk down the sidewalk and just kind of start to notice the number of stimuli that you're presented with. Mm-hmm. To be able to make sense of that without just melting down and just going off the rails, we have a cognitive system that is fast and frugal. It allows us to immediately kind of fit a heuristic, a model that we have in mind to something that we're presented with in a way to make sense of it that doesn't drain bandwidth, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of framing, and this is I think this is not my point by any means, is how you present messages in a way that activates the other system of thinking, which Daniel Kahneman calls kind of system 2, or slow and effortful thinking. So much of our thinking on social issues is just we hear a message, we know what it's about, like we're there, and we've already made sense of it. And so a lot of framing is about interrupting that, coming up with frames that force people to kind of step back and stop system 1 and engage system 2 in a more kind of effortful and deliberate way. But to me, it's the distinction, and when people, it goes back to your first question of kind of frames are a million different things in a million different places, and a lot of people talk about kind of frames in media or in communications, and also frames in mind. Mm-hmm. And I think that at Frameworks, we've made the very deliberate distinction between frames as this kind of, as external cues, mm-hmm. and cultural models as this internal set of ways of making meaning that those frames activate and that inform our opinions and attitudes. And I think that, I mean, it's one of the kind of areas where anthropology and psychological anthropology in particular gives us a really unique and different way of thinking about that question, of how when I present you with a piece of information on early childhood or guns, I can do so in a way that kind of, it sounds like science fiction, but that selectively activates different ways for you to make sense of that information by embedding different frames in that message. And I think that that's kind of the connection between messages on the outside, mm-hmm. and meaning making on the inside.
That makes all the sense. I mean, I think that's where you can go back to the California story, right, or a marriage equality story.
Yep.
Rights and benefits brings you to we know now,
yep.
brought you to a very different place than when you're talking about love and commitment. Are there any particular phrases? And this is framing for dummies, and this is we got a question,
which is good because I'm not sure there is framing for dummies.
From Mark Miller, who wants to know if you can give examples of an issue where reframing the debate led to successful change.
Reframing the debate led to successful change. All right, thank you, Mark.
Questions about that, yeah.
Okay, so marriage equality is one.
Yeah.
Do you want to do kind of the quick and dirty, or do you want me to do this?
You can go. I mean, I'll
take a swing at it.
Yeah,
I mean, both of us. Honestly, you can read this in SSIR, or The Atlantic did a really wonderful. Molly Ball did a really wonderful piece laying out over the course of about 8 or 9 pages, so it's kind of a long read, about marriage equality and all the research and work that went into it. But suffice to say, the very fast and dirty and slightly inaccurate version is that Proposition 8 was set to ban marriage in California. It was going to be defeated. It was going to be the first state that allowed gay and lesbian couples to marry. And there was a lot of money from advocates and others who'd gone into the state, and they were presenting ads. One of them, I think, became quite famous, was the 1,132 rights and benefits that confer to you when you get married. And it was quite impressive, because one of the ideas that they were driving was this idea of, like, if you're a gay or lesbian couple and your partner falls ill, you don't have the right or ability to go into the hospital and help administer care or even offer comfort. And that was fundamentally unfair. So come election day, it's the same day in 2008 that Barack Obama was running for president. He won 61% of the vote statewide. Prop 8 was expected to go in a positive way towards marriage equality. It ends up failing at the 11th hour, to the surprise of everyone, because people had been polling right up until basically election day. And the consequence of that was some people in the advocacy community said, we just need to do more and better and louder and bigger. And a few other folks, including the Walter and Evelyn Haas Jr. Fund, the Gill Foundation, and a bunch of other really heroic organizations, did this really incredible thing. They said, maybe there's more to this. Maybe we could step back and see if there's another lesson that we could learn, which takes a tremendous amount of humility. And they went and did, with a number of different organizations, a lot of qualitative and quantitative research. And what they came up with was this idea that the marriage vows that we're all kind of familiar with from, like, watching, the average sitcom, for richer, for poor, and sickness and in health. I don't think my marriage vows actually had that. But they had something like
Sorry,
that.
Man.
I don't. It's been a while. My wife will tell you the word obey was definitely not in there. I can tell you that. But suffice to say, the traditional wedding vows were actually quite persuasive in helping people shift the way they thought about it, particularly folks sort of in the persuadable political middle, right, ideologically speaking. These are people who were just stuck. They didn't see marriage equality as they saw it as somehow othering, that gay and lesbian couples wanting to marry was different than their own traditional straight couple marriages. And that when you talked about love and commitment, and that the reason the gay and lesbian couples wanted to marry was to celebrate the same love and commitment and build families and everything else, which is in fact exactly what they wanted to do, that resonated. That when you talked about, like, yes, everybody wants to marry and has to endure the same trials and tribulations and happiness and joys that come with that kind of commitment, you've suddenly found people. In fact, I think there's some research, you can actually look this up online, you can see people in focus groups and lights going on, like, oh my goodness, they, gay and lesbian couples, want to get married. It was like, so light went on with them. So it was a recasting, a reframing, and that really helped. Subsequently, it was Maine, Maryland, Washington State, and Minnesota all had ballot initiatives within a couple of years. They recast it around love and commitment, and every single state, where I think they were 0 for 32 on the ballot, and it had actually been used as a wedge issue. 0 for 32 on the ballot, suddenly all 4 states had a favorable outcome, and that ultimately turned the tide towards the Supreme Court a couple years later, taking a case and then ultimately deciding that marriage would be the law of the land for everyone. That was a hopefully fairly good example of how it was recast, and that a bunch of, including Barack Obama, shifted their thinking about it, started talking about love and commitment.
I think the important, there's one to kind of call back a point that I made earlier. It's not that a bunch of smart people just got in a room and came up with that. It was a lot of research. Right. I mean, it was deliberate. It was intentional. It was research. It was trying this and seeing what it does. It was kind of iteratively working from that and building this idea. And it was an empirical process.
It was that's totally worth saying.
That's a part of the story, and obviously I'm biased because that's what I do.
Right.
But that's a part of the story that I don't think gets told enough. It wasn't just, they locked the doors and didn't leave until they figured it out what the solution was. Yeah. They saw it as a question that could be ascertained and figured out by message development and testing, and also a better understanding of how people thought about marriage. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. That was a big piece of it, right? We're good. Okay, so let's keep going. The communications for dummies question, or the framing for dummies question is, are there any kind of phrases or cues that are most effective in triggering behaviors, yay or nay? So is it better to be positive or is it better to be negative, as a for instance? I'm for this or I'm against that.
I think there's probably a set of things that we could come up with as kind of relatively hard and fast rules across issues. And I'm not sure it's positive, negative, but we can certainly say that it is unproductive to be all about the problem, and it is more productive to be balanced with the kind of balanced between the problem and the solution. Like that's a pretty, I think, well accepted across research on different issues.
And is there a cultural piece to that? Is there a cultural explanation
just
for that?
Think about it. And I don't know if it's cultural. It's more. I think it's more cognitive. I think anthropologists rarely say that things hold cross-culturally. I think that this one is probably likely to hold up across culture. So think about if all I ever tell you is the problem.
We're not going to hang out too often.
Problem. Story about problem. Data about problem. Like, what are you going to do? Is that going to be something that in today's world that you?
Eventually, I'm going to see you on the street and I'm going to turn around and walk the other way. I'm going to be
That's
like,
it, though.
Nat's about to tell me about a problem
it's like,
again.
Peace, I'm out.
Yeah.
Right? Disengagement. You take that problem, which I've now done an incredibly good job of framing as big and bad and on fire and, crisis, and you just put it in the stack over here with all the other big, bad, dire, and on fire problems about which you haven't been told anything can be done. Right? So I think that, you do need some grip in a message, and there needs to be some urgency. But if that's all you ever get, which is, I can tell you, all people ever get on a lot of the issues that we work on. We've done a lot of work on child abuse and neglect in the UK in particular, and I can tell you for like 50 years, if you're a member of the British public, that's all you've been getting on child abuse and neglect.
Give me an example.
So, this is an interesting, I won't tell you the organization to look at their previous ads, but you can look up PSAs or kind of do some Googling on UK abuse and neglect. And in terms of video pieces or text-based pieces, you see that what they're doing in terms of kind of the composition of a piece of communications, the wording, is that they're focused on driving home two things. It's prevalent, it's more prevalent than you think, and wow, it is horrible. Full stop, that's it. And so if that's all you ever get, prevalent, horrible, prevalent, horrible, prevalent, horrible,
I'm depressed.
Do you think that there's anything that we can actually do about this? And is your attention, other than donating, £5, is your attention best spent on that issue, or is it best spent on an issue where you have some sense of efficacy, some sense that there's something you can do?
So agency is a big piece of it.
Yeah, agency, the construct that's kind of juxtaposed with urgency is frequently efficacy.
Okay.
So the extent to which we think that there are things that can be done. And I think the UK abuse and neglect is a great example because you can actually see, as the result of research that we and others have done, that they aren't doing that thing anymore.
What are they doing now?
They're doing something that's not all black and white and has those, organ horrible, music and sound with the kid with the big dirty face and, the big eyes. They're doing something that features solutions. There's something that's more optimistic. It's more explanatory. And the ask is kind of a part of the communication in a way that it wasn't, other than donate before. There's some really good examples. There's some of my favorite kind of before and after examples where you can just, even if I played it without sound, you could tell that there has been a dramatic difference in the way that this one particular organization is framing its stuff.
And you're going to do this because you're going to be with us at ComNet, so maybe I can ask. We're not going to be able to do it with video right this minute, but we'll do that there.
Yeah.
So hopefully you'll join us in San Francisco. Looks like Emma has another question.
Sarah wants to know how you determine who's worth targeting and who's a lost cause or already converted when you're framing.
This is it's a fantastic and potentially more provocative question than Sarah intended it to be. I'd say that is a huge difference between researchers and practitioners in communication. So there are a lot of people who view communications as something, get a little bit provocative here, but not too much, as something that should kind of split, divide, and bring a little bit of people from the middle over. Right? That's a kind of legislative strategy, an electoral strategy. But I would say that's really different than how frameworks and I think about communications. I think that there are powerful messages, not that are going to work for everybody, but that messages that are going to kind of create common understandings and identities around issues and kind of move everyone forward not to get out and vote for a particular issue at a particular time, but kind of to change culture over time.
Right.
And I think that the kind of scale and time frame that different communications kind of thinkers think about is a really important distinction. So for a lot of people, it's that immediate win in which you've got to get 51%. And then for other people, I think it's kind of how you over time build a movement that kind of brings everybody in the direction that we think people should move.
Sure. I mean, look, if you look at marriage equality,
Yeah.
there are plenty of folks, some probably watching, who remember Stonewall. I mean, that was many folks think of that as the beginning, and that was not 5 minutes before Prop 8. That was decades prior. So it was a long slog, and I think actually almost any example you can point to of like real big culture shifts, they take long periods of time. I mean, not geologic time, but in human scale, long periods of time, generations sometimes.
And I think that the really interesting debate to have, and I'm interested in this debate, I obviously have a perspective on it, is do you get that kind of slow, gradual, but ultimately so much more important culture change by kind of splitting and dividing and moving the people who are on your side to action and alienating others? Or do you get it by trying to build a bigger tent and move more people toward a perspective or a way of seeing an issue?
I mean, look, we have conversations in this country all the time about the culture wars, and they've persisted and they continue to persist, unfortunately. Got another one?
From Caitlin, who wants to know some of the questions that you can ask your audience to sort of uncover their underlying thinking about an issue.
So is this like you can do it at home, frameworks at home?
Yeah, hey.
Questions you can ask.
We definitely do a kind of research that is, we publish it in peer-reviewed journals, but that also doesn't mean that perfect has to be the enemy of any good, or however that statement goes. And I think that just kind of moving from this is a creative art to this is an empirical pursuit, I think is an important shift. So kind of anything that people can do to begin to understand deep level thinking of audience and kind of pilot or test messages is certainly, in my book, a good move. So in those interviews where we're looking at, again, not what people know about an issue, but how they think about an issue, we are tasked with the difficult job of getting people to think about issues. And so the kinds of questions that you ask are not kind of tell me what you know about marriage equality or guns or addiction, but it's questions that are hard to ask and frustrating to answer about how stuff works, right? Tell me a story. So you want explanation, you want narrative, and you want to look at that over the course of a number of hours of people talking about an issue, and then over the course of many interviews with different people about that issue. So they're questions that kind of invite people to explain their thinking. So kind of why. It's kind of you kind of pretend you're a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, and you do an interview from that perspective. So you said that you think it's really important that people go out and seek treatment if they have addiction. Why is that? Like, how does that work? Why is that so important? What would happen if someone did? And so you're interested in getting those questions that elicit the kind of explanation and narration from which you can see the patterns of thinking that are informing that. It's a really different way of doing an interview. It's why when we do these interviews, they're frequently 2-hour-long interviews, where you're just sitting down and your task as a researcher, as an interviewer, is to get that person to talk about that issue for 2 hours.
And then you have to unpack it.
And then you have, frequently on projects, 2,000-3,000 pages of transcripts that you are looking for assumptions, which are hard to look for. Right? You're looking at what is unsaid that is being unsaid and unspoken across many different people.
And then that's what you can tap into.
And that's how people think. That's thinking.
Yeah. this is a case where your friends and family can actually be some of your best allies, because they're probably sick of you. If you're like my family, they're sick of hearing you talk about work and how obsessed you are. But they'll tell you a hell of a lot about what actually registers and what resonates, right? Yeah. Or even about how they think about it, which is infinitely more important and interesting. How do you know you've chosen the right frame, right? Or you found the right way of reframing an issue? So the example of child abuse in the UK. How did you guys know, okay, eureka, aha, is it like that? Is it that clean of a kill? Is it a, yes, okay, it was this, now it needs to be that? Or is it sort of an iterative process?
So there's a research way of answering that question and a kind of a practitioner in the real world way of answering that question.
Give me both.
I'll do the researcher one first, which is, when you run an experiment, you have a set of different messages that you're exposing people to. Right? Those are the independent variables. Those are the things that you're varying to see what kind of effect they have on a set of outcomes, which are the dependent variables. And so one way of answering that question is, what are the dependent variables that we're looking to move? And in the work that we do at Frameworks, which is different than some other, different goals than other communications researchers, we're interested in how you understand an issue, what your attitudes are about it, how do you support solutions, what's your kind of feeling of efficacy, willingness to engage, mobilize, feeling that change is possible. Those are the outcomes we're interested in. Other people are interested in things like, would you donate money? Would you vote a particular way? And those are valid and important outcomes, but they are not, given the kind of slow, gradual culture change work we're trying to do, we are interested in more of the understanding, attitudes, kind of solutions thinking kind of outcomes. So when we test frames and we see that framing issues of parenting in Australia around parenting effectiveness actually decreases people's support for a whole bunch of policies that matter, and framing the same initiative using a child development frame has the exact opposite effect, that's kind of a eureka moment. We know that if those differences, minor differences in framing, are leading to relatively massive differences in outcomes, we've got something that is doing something, that is kind of shifting thinking in a direction that our outcomes indicate is important. In terms of the applied question, when things that I see that help me know that something that we've done is working is in to some degree stickiness. Right? If you've come up with a frame, can people in the field actually use it? And when they do, does it stick and persist? The best frame in a lab, if someone won't say it, and if when they do, other people don't, that's an indication to me that you may have something kind of in the lab that works, but in the real world probably isn't what it needs to be.
Okay, makes good sense. We got another one.
Ted wants to know how you ensure that shifting the frame isn't a one-way street. Can it be a way to improve a problem-solving strategy by creating a feedback opportunity?
So not what I want to say or what they need to hear, but how do we use this so that we're getting smarter, wiser, and better along the way?
That's it. That's the goal. This is another difference between kind of partisan work that looks to advance a policy or get people to vote in a particular way, and work that's trying to increase understanding and make people, and it sounds patronizing, I don't mean it in that way, make people smarter about issues. That's the work that we at Frameworks are trying to do. It's more about explanation rather than persuasion. So we're trying to get people to be smarter about how issues that are really complicated work, such that anything that you put in front of people after they are smarter, they can be kind of better solutions analyzers about anything that comes in front of them. And so I think that it's very much, I don't know if I would have ever described it as kind of two-way, one-way, but I think that's what's behind Ted's question. It's not that you're just framing to influence people toward a very particular direction, but rather you're framing to kind of change the context in which anything that comes into that context happens. You kind of change the policy context rather than drive it at a very specific kind of point in time.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, that's a two-way street. That creates all kinds of feedbacks between discourse and that thinking, between policy and that thinking, and that's really what you're ideally trying to create.
Looks like we have another one.
Edith wants to know if you could speak about framing that leads to sustained engagement or action. Her interest is in helping people take actions that become part of their lives or habits and not the one-time sign a petition or click here.
So this is systemic change. Framing to move systemic thinking or move systems and values, that sort of thing.
And I think that's, I mean, that was Edith. That is the kind of work that we are trying to help folks do. Mm-hmm. I think that unfortunately it's a lot easier to frame to get someone to do a really particular behavior at a particular time than it is kind of to change fundamentally about how people think about issues. And I think the part of the answer is that you would never expect sustained change in thinking to happen from one exposure to a message. Mm-hmm. So it's not that a nonprofit is going to go out and issue a press release with the most brilliantly framed way of talking about immigration and everyone's mind is going to be blown and changed forever. And that's never what you would expect, but rather it's this kind of dose-response scenario where what you want is you want to get those great frames into a lot of people's communication through a lot of channels and over a lot of time to be able to have that kind of slow but sustained work on culture being done. And I think that it's kind of a trap to fall into to expect or to think that kind of one dose of a frame is going to have the effects that as people committed to social change that we want to have.
Got another one.
These are good questions. These are hard questions. Can we have an easy one?
Sure. Someone is looking
What's your name? Nat.
Hi.
Someone's looking for recommendations on just additional resources, whether books, sites, or papers so they can keep learning about framing and narratives and communications research in general.
Well, I'll do, while you're thinking about the answer to that, the good answer to that, I'll give you the shameless plug. You should definitely read the series Picture This in Stanford Social Innovation Review. Not least of which, because I think one of the things we actually kind of achieved over the span of the 7 or 8 pieces is that you start to kind of understand there are already, in anything, almost any issue we're working on, there are dominant frames. I think that was that was the premise of sort of doing this. Is there's already a dominant frame present. It's a piece of the culture. And that there are also interventions you can offer that will not, as Nat said, you're not going to do it once and it's going to fix it, but if we could do it, if you can, or your organization, or multiple organizations over time can commit to shifting the conversation by reframing it, eventually you can see some pretty profound shifts. And there are examples of that. The marriage equality one obviously is the one that immediately jumps to mind, tobacco the other. All right, so that's what I said. Read SSIR.
I mean,
what would you say we should read?
So I think that you all have resources about framing that are available.
And you guys do too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both have things that are, I mean, as a mission-driven nonprofit, all of our work that we've ever done on any issue is free and publicly available on our website. And that includes kind of specific recommendations on particular issues, but it also includes things that we write about kind of the theory and scholarship of framing and framing methods that I think can kind of help people think about these things. And we try, wherever possible, to robustly cite where that theory that we use comes from, such that if you are interested in kind of following through and going deeper, you can actually look at some of the research and the more theoretical pieces that inform the work that we do. And
you mentioned the Daniel Kahneman book. If you don't have an appetite for thinking fast and slow, which is excellent, there's the Michael Lewis book. It's called The Undoing Project, which is wonderful. And Nat would sit there as an academic and say, it's at a 5th grade reading level, but I read at a 5th grade reading level. And so it's a wonderful kind of, I think, sort of recitation of how this whole field, in a way, kind of got underway. It's really, the story itself is fascinating, but then some of the insights you'll glean as you read it. So if you're in the market for a good summer beach, I don't know if I'd call it a beach read. I'll call it a beach read because I'm a geek. The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis is worth your time. And
Thinking Fast and Slow is my absolute favorite framing book. It's about that thick, though.
Yes, it is.
And it was on my bedside table for quite a while. And was responsible for many nights of putting me to sleep, but it is as a resource, as an in-depth kind of overview of the work that informs the way that we do this work and other people do this work. That is, you could not find a better place to, maybe not to start, but to eventually get.
I was going to say, if you need the gateway drug, it's the Undoing Project, and then once you finish with that, maybe you do Thinking Fast and Slow. How are we doing on time? We are. Can we indulge you for another couple of minutes? Because I've got a couple of questions. Do we have any more coming through?
We do have a couple more.
All right, let's be. It ain't about what I want to know, because I can always chat with you afterwards. What else we got?
This one is asking sort of about the relation, the fast and slow thinking and framing, and then where would you place the role of emotion in this discussion, and does the fight or flight instinct work within that as well? This is from David.
So I'll use my prerogative to pick which one of those to answer. I think the emotion one is a these are all good questions. That's a super good question. And so I'll just kind of get up on one of my soapboxes for a second, which is I think there's a danger with emotion and it's the same danger that we have with the R word, resonance, is that we assume that just getting people to be emotional or just getting a message to resonate is our end goal. It's all we need to do. And I think there are some great examples where you can resonate very powerfully or generate some very powerful emotions that actually work against your strategic goal. And I think urgency and crisis and fear are great examples. So those are powerful emotions. Those get people to just crank that dial up. But if your goal is something other than getting people to crank that dial up, fear and crisis and fatalism are things that actually depress a lot of the more strategic goals that communicators might have. So getting people to engage, getting people kind of mobilized around an issue, thinking differently about solutions. And so I would say emotion and resonance are necessary but insufficient. They are means, not ends. Every effective message has to have an emotional component and it has to resonate. But those emotions and areas of resonance have to line up with what we ultimately want a message to do. And I think that sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that kind of our job as communicators is just to get people to
it's not a singular
rip
task.
That dial up,
I mean,
right?
You guys behind the camera hear me say this. Like, what do we want people to think? What do we want them to feel? And then what do we want them to believe?
Yep.
Right? It's not any one of those. It's all in concert, and they happen over different periods of time when it's working well. All right, I'm going to take the prerogative here. Values, metaphors, narratives, and messengers. Is there a first among equals when it comes to the elements of framing? Like, what's your favorite?
True framing geek question.
I'm with you, man.
That's good. I mean, I have a favorite. I don't think it's...
All right, what is your favorite and why?
I love metaphors.
Oh, good. Me too.
And I love them because they do what I think is the most underdone but important part of a communication, which is explanation. Kind of making people smarter, again, not in a patronizing way, about how issues work. So metaphors can be incredibly powerful in taking something that people are not familiar with or kind of is opaque and abstract and illustrating certain parts of how it works. And just from exposure to a really brief metaphor that compares something that people have no idea how it works to something that we all have kind of immediate familiarity with can be, I mean, there are rarely epiphanies when it comes to communications, but I think that some of those metaphor moments really are. So the difference and the effect that just varying one metaphor versus another. So there's great work, and we haven't done it, done by some academics. One of our staff was part of some groups that did this, of just the difference between talking about crime as a beast versus crime as a virus. And the different outcomes that choice, and in these treatments, it's the difference of maybe 15 words. The difference in outcomes that creates in terms of how people think about crime. The difference between being incredibly punitive and being incredibly preventative in how people think about justice policy, just from the metaphor that's invoked in the communication.
And so if we can go deep geek for a quick minute, explain to me how metaphor works in the brain. Because I think I have an idea of it, but you actually know the answer to this. What happens in your brain when you hear a metaphor?
So there's a continuum of metaphor scholars. There's all the way from people who think that all cognition is analogic. So there is not a thought that you have in your head that is not metaphor at some level.
Okay.
To people that say, kind of in the middle, every 24th word that we hear is metaphor, to people who don't really believe that metaphor is all that it's cracked up to be. But really what metaphor does is a process called mapping. So you take an issue, which is called the target domain, which is the thing that you're trying to communicate about, so crime, and then you take a source domain that you're making the connection to, beast or virus, and you are activating both of those domains in a way that allows people to think about crime based on what they know about beasts. And that once that connection happens, you're thinking about crime in a way that's different from the way you were thinking about it before that mapping happened. And so the way that this is like this allows you to think about crime in very specific ways.
Gotcha.
How it actually works in the brain, I have no idea. That's mapping.
That's mapping.
That's
all right.
mapping.
We have more questions? We do. Yes. Okay. Let's take one more. We've gone a little over time. You okay?
I'm good. One more is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you guys talked a little bit about positive and negative frames earlier, but Joanne wants to know about the role of positive versus negative frames, and for example, could you respond to the current immigration crisis and the forced separation of parents and children and that framing mechanism?
So we did, just again, shameless plug, the SSIR series, folks at MacArthur and folks from Frameworks did a piece on immigration, but I'll let you take a swing at this. Well, maybe just avail yourself of that after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess generally you could say that positive framing of an issue is more effective, but I don't know if I agree with that, and I don't know if you can actually say that.
I think that's pretty broad.
I think that's really broad. There's different ways that you can frame positively. There's different ways that you can frame negatively, and there's obviously different issues. But immigration is an interesting example. So we did a lot of kind of metaphor work on immigration, and some of that work tested what was at that time, but I think is less so now, a dominant metaphor in the field, talking about kind of bringing immigrants out of the shadows.
Yep.
But that was a dominant metaphor, and one that I would say is largely a kind of fear-based negative metaphor. And we found pretty clearly that metaphor kind of reinforces all of the fears that many people have, unfounded fears about immigrants, that they are kind of shady criminals in the shadows. And it has this clearly unintended backfire effect of actually making people kind of more repressive and punitive in thinking about immigration reform. And if you have a metaphor that creates, instead of and what it's really doing is it's kind of allowing people to do the us-them thing that we know people have a very easy time doing on immigration. And that if you can think of metaphors, team metaphors or metaphors that talk about kind of collective progress, and that instead of doing this, which I guess is negative, have a positive component that creates a we rather than an us and a them. That the we metaphors that force you to think about kind of collective identity are much more powerful in their ability to kind of shift people to a progressive perspective on it.
And they're more aspirational.
So whether that's positive or
right?
negative, I'm not sure. Out of the Shadows is definitely a kind of fear-based negative.
And dominant, right? Because I remember the SSIR piece, one of the things that they said was that Bernie Sanders had actually used that phrase quite a lot on the campaign trail. So it's quite well known. And everyone
Obama has used it.
A lot of people have used it. So this is one of those cases where I think like well-intended people are oftentimes doing harm reinforcing sort of cultural norms or cultural thinking that is problematic.
Yep.
We could probably talk for another couple of hours,
We could.
but I know you're going to Australia in like a hot minute.
I am.
So maybe we should let you go home and pack. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, everybody. I'm sure you'd like to hear more from Nat. So number one, again, last time I'm going to do this, check out SSIR for Picture This, the series. You can just find it by Googling it, or if you're on our email list, you may have gotten it. And then Nat's going to be with us at ComNet 18 in San Francisco. So you'll have a chance to spend a couple days hanging out with him, having a glass of wine, that kind of good stuff. And I'm looking forward to seeing you.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks for having me, man.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you. All right,
yeah,
cheers.
Thank you.